On the night of September 13th, 1942, at 11:27, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson crouched in the muddy foxholes of Henderson Field, listening to the jungle breathe around him. The air hung thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and cordite, punctuated by the distant crack of sniper fire and the metallic click of Thompson's submachine guns being checked one final time. At 46 years old, Carlson was an outsider in his own corps, a man who had spent years with Chinese guerrillas, watching them turn darkness into an ally instead of an enemy. Now he faced Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, which had surrounded the thin American perimeter with over 2,500 Japanese soldiers who believed one simple doctrine: night fighting cancels American firepower. For weeks, Japanese commanders had whispered the same message to their men, that in the black jungle, bayonets beat bullets, and Marines would freeze when they couldn't see their targets. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's assault troops had already proven it worked, slipping through the darkness to within yards of Marine positions before unleashing coordinated attacks that left Americans shooting at shadows and sounds. The problem was brutal and personal. When visibility collapsed to arm's length, the Thompson submachine gun, the Marines' best close-range weapon, became almost too dangerous to use because its .45 caliber report sounded exactly like Japanese .25 caliber weapons in the chaos of night combat. Marine commanders had started pulling Thompsons from night patrols entirely, afraid their own men would hear the familiar burst and shoot toward it, mistaking friend for enemy. The weapon that should have been perfect for jungle fighting, shoulder-fired, fast cycling, built for sudden close contact, was being abandoned just when Marines needed it most. Carlson's three-man fire teams carried them anyway, along with Browning automatic rifles and Springfield rifles, but every squeeze of the trigger in darkness was a gamble. Would the sound save your life or end it? As Kawaguchi's attack columns moved through the jungle toward Edson's Ridge, closing the distance for what Japanese doctrine promised would be a decisive night assault, Carlson made a choice that would flip everything the enemy believed about American fighting in the dark. He didn't ban the Thompson, he built rules around it that would let Marines use their deadliest close-range weapon without killing each other. But first, his men would have to survive the next 6 hours, when 2,500 Japanese soldiers planned to prove that American firepower meant nothing after sunset. The alarm that shattered the Lunga perimeter at 2:37 on the morning of September 15th came not from Japanese infiltrators, but from the sound of an American Thompson submachine gun firing 3 quick bursts into the darkness. Private First Class Robert Chen had spotted movement 30 yards beyond his foxhole, squeezed the trigger of his M19 28A1 Thompson, and watched the muzzle flash illuminate nothing but swaying kunai grass and his own nerves. The problem wasn't his shooting, it was what happened next. 2 Marines from L Company, positioned 60 yards to Chen's left, heard the distinctive chatter of what sounded like Japanese automatic fire and immediately opened up with their Garands in the direction of the sound. Their 8-round clips pinged empty in the darkness as Chen dove for cover, realizing that his own weapon had nearly gotten him killed by his own men. The .45 caliber Thompson, firing at 600 rounds per minute, produced a sound signature that trained American ears often couldn't distinguish from Japanese .25 caliber weapons in the confusion of night combat. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hannikin had seen this nightmare play out 17 times in the past month. Marines armed with the weapon supposedly perfect for jungle fighting, a shoulder-fired submachine gun that could dump 20 rounds from a box magazine or 50 from a drum in seconds, were being forced to choose between using their best close-range tool and risking friendly fire. The mathematics were brutal. Visibility in the Guadalcanal jungle collapsed to 15 feet on a clear night, 5 feet in rain, and the human ear became the primary identification system for everything beyond arm's reach. Captain William Morrison, commanding Easy Company, had started ordering his men to leave their Thompsons in their tents during night patrols, carrying only bolt-action Springfields and Garands that produced distinctly American sounds when fired. But this left his patrol teams vulnerable at exactly the ranges where Japanese infiltration tactics were strongest. Enemy soldiers had been photographed carrying Type 99 Arisaka rifles with telescopic sights, moving through the jungle in small groups, closing to within 20 yards of American positions before opening fire with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. The sound identification crisis had roots in basic physics and battlefield chaos. The Thompson fired a .45 caliber cartridge, a heavy, slow bullet designed for close-range stopping power, while most Japanese small arms used what Americans called .25 caliber ammunition, actually 6.5 millimeter rounds that produce similar acoustic signatures when fired rapidly. In daylight, muzzle flash patterns, weapon silhouettes, and uniform identification made the distinction clear. In darkness, sound became everything, and sound was unreliable. Lieutenant William White, leading 3rd Platoon's night reconnaissance missions, had documented the problem in his patrol reports with clinical precision. On September 8th, his team had spent 43 minutes stalking what sounded like a Japanese machine gun position, only to discover 2 Marines from Fox Company who had gotten separated from their unit and were test firing a borrowed Thompson. On September 11th, White's radio man had called in artillery support on coordinates, where Japanese automatic weapons seemed to be setting up an ambush, coordinates that turned out to be occupied by an American listening post armed with a Browning automatic rifle and 2 Thompsons. The weapon itself was exactly what jungle combat demanded. The M19 28A1 Thompson weighed 9 3/4 pounds, fired from a closed bolt for first-round accuracy, and could be loaded with either 20-round box magazines for patrol work or 50-round drums for sustained fire. Its blowback operation was simple enough for Marines to field strip and clean in complete darkness, and the .45 caliber cartridge delivered enough energy to stop a charging enemy at ranges where rifles became unwieldy. Submachine gun doctrine emphasized controlled bursts of 3 to 6 rounds, not the wild spraying that Hollywood would later make famous, and Marines who knew their weapons could place accurate fire at ranges up to 100 yards. But doctrine meant nothing if commanders were too afraid of friendly fire casualties to let their men pull the trigger. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had received reports from 7 different battalion commanders describing the same tactical paralysis. Marines equipped with superior close-range firepower were losing night engagements because they couldn't safely employ their weapons without risking fratricide. The Japanese had built their entire Guadalcanal strategy around exploiting this American weakness. Intelligence intercepts translated by Marine linguists revealed that Japanese commanders were training their men to expect American confusion and hesitation during night attacks. Enemy tactical doctrine explicitly stated that darkness would neutralize American advantages in firepower, communications, and air support, forcing individual Marines to fight with bayonets and grenades at ranges where Japanese soldiers felt confident in their abilities. Colonel Evans Carlson, commanding the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, had been watching this problem develop with growing frustration. His raiders were organized around 3-man fire teams, each built around specific weapons assignments. 1 Marine carried a Browning automatic rifle for sustained fire, 1 carried a Springfield rifle for precision shooting, and 1 carried a Thompson for close-range work. The system assumed that all 3 weapons could be employed safely and effectively, but the sound confusion problem was breaking that assumption and leaving his fire teams functionally disarmed during their most vulnerable moments. Chen's near miss had been the 17th documented case of Marines nearly shooting other Marines because of Thompson sound signature confusion, and Hanneken knew the number was probably much higher because most incidents went unreported. The psychological effect was spreading through his battalion like a disease. Marines were losing confidence in their weapons, their communications, and their ability to function as a unit after dark. Japanese infiltrators had started using the confusion deliberately, firing short bursts from their own weapons to trigger American-friendly fire incidents, then attacking during the chaos that followed. The solution seemed impossible. Banning the Thompson would leave Marines defenseless against close-range night attacks. Continuing to use it would eventually result in Marines killing Marines in significant numbers. Vandegrift needed an answer that would let his men survive the night patrols that kept the Japanese from massing for major attack, while maintaining the firepower advantage that made American positions too costly for enemy forces to overrun. The weapon was never the problem. The problem was making it usable in conditions where sound traveled faster than sight, and mistakes meant friendly casualties in a war where every Marine mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson had spent 3 years with the 8th Route Army in China, watching communist guerrillas turn individual initiative into coordinated violence against Japanese occupation forces. The lessons he brought back to the Marine Corps were simple and radical: small units fighting with clear responsibilities, mutual support, and absolute trust in each other's capabilities. When his 2nd Raider Battalion arrived on Guadalcanal in November 1942, Carlson carried those lessons into the jungle where sound could kill you and hesitation meant death. His solution to the Thompson identification crisis wasn't to ban the weapon, it was to redesign how Marines used it. Carlson's 3-man fire teams represented a complete break from standard Marine doctrine, which relied on squad-sized units of 12 to 13 men operating under centralized control. Instead, each Raider fire team consisted of exactly 3 Marines with 3 specific jobs. The Browning automatic rifleman provided sustained firepower, the rifleman delivered precision shots and fed ammunition to his teammates, and the Thompson gunner existed for one purpose: winning the first 3 seconds of any close-range contact. The Chinese had taught Carlson that jungle warfare was won by the side that could make decisions faster, at the lowest level, and his fire teams reflected that philosophy. The Thompson gunner wasn't a support weapon operator or a backup rifleman. He was the primary assault specialist whose job began when the enemy closed to within 50 yards. At that range, the Thompson's capabilities became decisive. A shoulder-fired weapon that could deliver controlled bursts of .45 caliber ammunition through thick vegetation, reliable enough to function after being dragged through mud and water, and simple enough that any Marine could clear a jam or change magazines in complete darkness. Sergeant Major Jacob. Vuza, a Solomon Islander who had been tortured by Japanese forces and escaped to guide American patrols, worked directly with Carlson's teams to teach them how sound moved through different types of jungle terrain. In dense forest, gunfire echoed and distorted, making source location nearly impossible. In bamboo groves, sharp cracks could be heard clearly, but direction became confused by reflection. Along creek beds, the sound of water masked movement, but amplified sudden noises like magazine changes or bolt actions. Vuza's knowledge let Carlson's fire teams understand their acoustic environment and use it tactically. The Raiders developed a system of fire discipline that transformed the Thompson from a liability into an asset. Each fire team established sectors of responsibility before any patrol, with clear boundaries that prevented overlapping fire. The Thompson gunner operated within a 30-degree arc, directly to his team's front, while the barman covered the left flank and the rifleman covered the right. When contact was made, each Marine knew exactly where his teammates were and where they were authorized to shoot, eliminating the confusion that had caused friendly fire incidents in other units. More importantly, Carlson instituted challenge and password procedures that turned sound identification from guesswork into protocol. Before any Marine fired his Thompson, he was required to issue a verbal challenge unless the enemy was already shooting. The system wasn't perfect, stressed Marines sometimes forgot, and enemy soldiers occasionally learned American passwords, but it provided a framework that let Thompson gunners engage targets without automatically triggering friendly fire from neighboring positions. The weapons feeding system became crucial to Raider tactics. The M1928A1 Thompson could accept either 20-round box magazines or 50-round drum magazines, and Carlson's teams used both depending on their mission. Box magazines were preferred for patrol work because they were lighter, less bulky, and quieter when moving through vegetation. Drums were reserved for defensive positions or known enemy contact areas where sustained fire might be necessary. Each Thompson gunner carried 4 box magazines on patrol, giving him 80 rounds of immediate firepower before needing to reload from his teammates' ammunition supplies. Captain James Roosevelt, commanding a company of raiders and carrying the political weight of his father's name, proved that Carlson's system worked during the battalion's first major engagement. On November 4th, Roosevelt's company encountered a Japanese patrol near the Metapona River, and the contact began at exactly the range where traditional Marine tactics broke down, 25 yards in thick jungle with visibility limited to arm's length. Roosevelt's Thompson gunner, Corporal Anthony Palladino, fired 2 3-round bursts at muzzle flashes, barely visible through the vegetation, while his barman and riflemen provided covering fire that prevented the enemy from flanking the team's position. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and ended with 3 Japanese soldiers dead and Roosevelt's team intact, but more importantly, no American casualties from friendly fire. Neighboring Raider teams had heard Palladino's Thompson firing and correctly identified it as friendly because Roosevelt had issued the proper challenge beforehand, and his fire remained within his assigned sector. The system of controlled violence that Carlson had developed from Chinese guerrilla experience was proving that American firepower could be employed safely in conditions where previous doctrine had failed. The psychological effect on Carlson's Marines was immediate and powerful. They stopped seeing the Thompson as a dangerous weapon that might get them killed by their own men, and started viewing it as a specialized tool that gave them decisive advantages at close range. The confidence boost rippled through the entire battalion as Raiders realized they could use their full arsenal of weapons without fear of fratricide, making them more aggressive on patrol and more willing to close with enemy forces. Other Marine units on Guadalcanal began requesting transfers to Raider battalions, not for the elite status, but for the opportunity to fight with weapons they could actually employ. Word spread through the Lunga perimeter that Carlson's men had solved the Thompson problem, and individual Marines started adopting Raider fire discipline techniques, even when their own commanders hadn't officially approved the changes. The 3-man team concept was infectious because it addressed the fundamental issue that had been paralyzing American small unit tactics: how to maintain unit coherence and mutual support while giving individual Marines the authority to make life or death decisions in seconds. Carlson's Raiders were proving that the Thompson submachine gun wasn't the problem. The problem had been using it without proper organization, communication, and fire control measures. The weapon remained exactly what it had always been, a shoulder-fired automatic weapon designed for close-range combat. But now it was being employed by Marines who understood their responsibilities, knew their teammates' positions, and operated within a system that turned individual weapons into coordinated firepower. The jungle was still dangerous, but it was no longer forcing Americans to choose between effectiveness and safety. The captured diary of Lieutenant Yoshio Takahashi, found in a Japanese strongpoint near Kokumbona on December 2, 1942, contained a message that would become central to understanding how the enemy viewed American night fighting capabilities. Takahashi had copied orders from Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, distributed to all infantry commanders before the September assault on Henderson Field. The enemy's firepower will do nothing in the night and jungle. Our bayonets are our strength. Close quickly, strike hard, and their weapons become useless. The document, translated by Marine intelligence officers and distributed throughout the 1st Marine Division, revealed the fundamental assumption driving Japanese tactics on Guadalcanal. Colonel Merritt Edson had read Takahashi's diary 3 times, each reading deepening his anger at what the enemy believed about American fighting ability. Edson's 1st Raider Battalion had held the ridge that now bore his name by proving Japanese assumptions wrong, but the cost had been severe. 49 Marines killed and 137 wounded in 2 nights of fighting. The enemy had gotten close enough to use bayonets, grenades, and swords because they believed American automatic weapons would be ineffective in darkness, and they had nearly been proven right. The tactical reality that Kawaguchi's orders reflected was brutally simple. Japanese infantry doctrine assumed that closing to bayonet range would neutralize American advantages in firepower, communications, and artillery support. Enemy soldiers were trained to move silently through jungle terrain, approach American positions to within 10 yards, then launch coordinated attacks using edged weapons and grenades that didn't require aimed fire. The strategy had worked against British forces in Malaya and Burma, where European-trained troops had struggled to adapt their tactics to close-range jungle combat. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding Japanese forces throughout the Solomon Islands, had built his entire Guadalcanal campaign around the assumption that American Marines would freeze when forced to fight in conditions where they couldn't identify targets clearly. Intelligence reports captured from his 17th Army headquarters revealed that Japanese planners expected American morale to collapse once Marines realized their technological advantages had been neutralized by terrain and darkness. The plan was psychological as much as tactical: make Americans afraid to use their own weapons. Captain Lewis Puller, whose 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had been reinforcing the Lunga perimeter since September, understood that the Japanese weren't entirely wrong. American small unit tactics in 1942 were still based on European warfare concepts that emphasized centralized control, coordinated fire plans, and clear fields of observation. Marines were trained to fight in formations where individual weapons complemented each other under direct supervision from squad and platoon leaders. The jungle broke those formations down into isolated groups of 3 or 4 men who couldn't see beyond arm's length and couldn't communicate with their commanders. The Thompson submachine gun represented everything that Japanese doctrine claimed would fail in night combat. It was an automatic weapon that required target identification, a shoulder-fired gun that needed stable firing positions, and a ASAO, precision instrument that demanded fire discipline to avoid wasting ammunition. According to Kawaguchi's tactical theory, Marines armed with Thompsons would either hold their fire and lose close-range engagements, or fire wildly and reveal their positions while accomplishing nothing. The weapon that should have been ideal for jungle fighting would become a liability when Marines couldn't see what they were shooting at. Major John Antonelli, serving as operations officer for the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, had spent weeks analyzing after-action reports from units throughout the Guadalcanal perimeter, looking for patterns in successful and unsuccessful night engagements. His findings challenged every assumption in the Japanese tactical manual. American casualties were highest in units that had restricted automatic weapons use during night operations, and lowest in units that had maintained aggressive patrolling with full weapons employment. The Marines who were surviving night contact were the ones who had learned to use their Thompsons effectively despite the identification challenges. The enemy's confidence in their night fighting superiority had been earned through experience. Colonel Toshinari Shoji, commanding the 230th Infantry Regiment, had personally led night attacks that had overrun prepared American positions by closing to grenade range before defenders could respond effectively. Shoji's men moved through jungle terrain with a skill that reflected years of training in similar conditions throughout the Pacific, and they understood how to use darkness, vegetation, and American hesitation as tactical weapons. But Kawaguchi's orders had been written before the Japanese encountered Carlson's raiders, and the assumptions they contained were becoming obsolete. Marine units that had adopted raider fire team tactics were proving that American automatic weapons could be devastatingly effective in night combat when employed by men who understood their capabilities and limitations. The Thompson wasn't failing because it was unsuited to jungle conditions. It was failing when used by Marines who hadn't been trained to fight as cohesive small units with clear responsibilities and mutual trust. The diary entries that followed Takahashi's copy of Kawaguchi's orders told a different story than the confident predictions of easy victory. Japanese soldiers were reporting that some American patrols were becoming increasingly aggressive, closing to contact ranges and employing automatic weapons with precision that suggested improved training and leadership. Enemy casualties were mounting in engagements where Japanese forces had expected to achieve surprise and quick victory through bayonet attacks. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Page, whose machine gun section had held a critical position during the October 25th Japanese assault, represented the kind of American fighting that was making Japanese confidence obsolete. Page had coordinated the fire of multiple automatic weapons, including several Thompson submachine guns, in a night engagement that lasted over 3 hours and resulted in more than 200 enemy casualties. His Marines had used their weapons aggressively and effectively, maintaining fire discipline while engaging targets at ranges where Japanese doctrine predicted American collapse. The fundamental flaw in Kawaguchi's tactical theory was the assumption that American weapons required American weaknesses. Japanese planners had correctly identified that most Marine units were struggling with night combat, but they had incorrectly concluded that this struggle was inherent to American equipment and training. The reality was that Marines were learning to adapt their tactics to jungle conditions, and the Thompson was becoming a centerpiece of that adaptation rather than a liability to be avoided. Intelligence reports reaching Hyakutaki's headquarters were beginning to reflect a troubling pattern. Japanese night attacks were taking longer to achieve their objectives, requiring more men to accomplish the same results, and suffering higher casualties than tactical plans had predicted. American resistance wasn't collapsing when forced into close-range combat. It was becoming more organized and more deadly. The enemy's fundamental assumption about American fighting ability in jungle conditions was being proven wrong by Marines who had learned to use their weapons effectively, regardless of visibility or terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Carlson stood in the command post bunker at Henderson Field on November 12, 1942, studying patrol sector maps with Captain James Roosevelt and explaining why banning the Thompson had been exactly the wrong lesson to draw from the friendly fire incidents. The weapon itself had never been the problem. The problem was using it without proper organization, clear communication protocols, and disciplined fire control measures. Carlson's solution wasn't revolutionary, but it was systematic. Build rules that allowed Marines to employ their most effective close-range weapons safely, rather than abandoning it when they needed it most. The first component of Carlson's system was sectors of fire, a concept borrowed directly from his observations of Chinese communist guerrillas who had survived 3 years fighting Japanese forces in similar terrain. Each 3-man raider team established specific areas of responsibility before beginning any patrol, with clear boundaries that prevented overlapping fire and eliminated the confusion that had caused Marines to shoot at each other. The Thompson gunner operated within a 30-degree arc directly to his team's front, while his teammates covered designated flanks with their Browning automatic rifle and Springfield rifle. When contact was initiated, every Marine knew exactly where his partners were positioned and where he was authorized to engage targets. Challenge and password procedures formed the second layer of Carlson's fire discipline system, addressing the acoustic identification problem that had made commanders afraid to let Marines use their Thompsons. Before engaging any target that hadn't already opened fire, raiders were required to issue verbal challenges using daily passwords distributed at patrol briefings. The system wasn't perfect, stressed Marines sometimes forgot the procedures, and Japanese soldiers occasionally learned American passwords, but it provided a framework that reduced friendly fire incidents to nearly zero while maintaining the aggressive patrolling that kept enemy forces off balance. The third element was controlled burst fire, a technique that transformed the Thompson from a weapon that sprayed ammunition wildly into a precision instrument for close-range combat. Marine Corps training manuals had always emphasized short bursts of 3 to 6 rounds rather than sustained automatic fire, but jungle conditions had made many Marines abandon fire discipline in favor of volume. Carlson's teams practiced burst control until it became automatic. with Thompson gunners trained to deliver exactly the amount of firepower needed to neutralize specific targets without wasting ammunition or revealing their positions unnecessarily. Weapon pairing represented the final component of the Raider fire team concept, ensuring that the Thompson never operated in isolation but always as part of a coordinated system that covered multiple ranges and target types. The Browning automatic rifle provided sustained fire for targets beyond 50 yards. The Springfield rifle delivered precision shots for individual enemy soldiers, and the Thompson handled everything that got close enough for assault range. Each weapon complemented the others, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no gaps for enemy infiltrators to exploit. Sergeant Anthony Palladino, serving as point man for Roosevelt's company during the November patrol operations, proved the effectiveness of Carlson's system during a contact near the Metapona River that began when his team encountered a Japanese patrol at 20 yards in dense jungle. Palladino issued the prescribed challenge, received an answer in broken English that didn't match the daily password, and immediately engaged with his Thompson, while his teammates provided supporting fire from their assigned positions. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes and resulted in 4 enemy casualties with no American losses or friendly fire incidents. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical improvements. Marines who had been afraid to use their most effective close-range weapon because it might get them killed by their own men suddenly found themselves equipped with a system that let them employ full firepower safely. The confidence boost rippled through Carlson's entire battalion as Raiders realized they could fight aggressively without fear of fratricide, making them more willing to close. With enemy forces and more effective in the close-range engagements that determined patrol success or failure. Major John Antonelli documented the results in operational reports that were circulated throughout the 1st Marine Division and eventually reached Marine Corps headquarters in Washington. Raider battalions using Carlson's fire team system were suffering significantly lower casualties than conventional Marine units, while inflicting higher casualties on enemy forces and completing patrol missions that had been considered too dangerous for other units. The Thompson wasn't being abandoned. It was being employed more effectively than ever before. Other Marine commanders began requesting detailed briefings on Raider tactics, and individual squads started adopting modified versions of Carlson's procedures, even when their battalion commanders hadn't officially authorized the changes. Lieutenant William White, whose reconnaissance platoon had suffered through weeks of friendly fire near misses, implemented challenge and password procedures and sectors of fire that immediately reduced confusion during night operations. His Marines were no longer afraid to use their Thompsons, and their patrol effectiveness improved dramatically. The campaign-level implications were becoming clear to Major General Alexander Vandegrift, who recognized that effective small-unit tactics were essential to maintaining the defensive perimeter that protected Henderson Field. Guadalcanal wasn't just a series of isolated patrol actions. It was a combined arms operation where land-based aviation, naval surface forces, and ground units had to work together to control the Solomon Islands. Small tactical improvements like safe employment of automatic weapons at night had strategic consequences because they enabled the aggressive patrolling that prevented Japanese forces from massing for major attacks. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Page, whose machine gun positions had held against repeated Japanese assaults, understood that weapons were only effective when Marines could use them without hesitation. His crews had learned to coordinate multiple automatic weapons, including Thompson submachine guns, in defensive positions that required precise fire discipline and mutual support. The techniques that Carlson had developed for patrol work were proving equally valuable in static defense, where Marines needed to engage multiple targets at different ranges without shooting each other. The system's effectiveness was tested severely during the November fighting, when Carlson's Raiders conducted the longest patrol in Marine Corps history, 150 miles through enemy-controlled territory, over 29 days. The Raiders encountered Japanese forces 17 times, engaged in 12 firefights, and completed their mission with acceptable casualties while inflicting significant losses on enemy units. Every engagement had involved Thompson submachine guns employed, according to Carlson's fire discipline procedures, and none had resulted in friendly fire casualties. By December, Marine units throughout the Guadalcanal perimeter were implementing versions of Raider small unit tactics, recognizing that the Thompson's effectiveness depended not on the weapon's characteristics, but on how Marines used it. The submachine gun that had been considered too dangerous for night operations was becoming the cornerstone of American small unit tactics in jungle terrain. Carlson had proven that a weapon doesn't just need firepower, it needs permission to be used safely and effectively by Marines who understand their responsibilities and trust their teammates completely. The patrol that broke the system came on the night of December 9, 1942, when exhaustion, equipment failure, and crossed routes combined to create exactly the conditions that had originally made commanders afraid of the Thompson submachine gun. Corporal Robert Chen, the same Marine whose Thompson had triggered friendly fire concerns in September, was leading a 3-man reconnaissance team through the jungle west of Henderson Field when tropical rain reduced visibility to 0 and radio static cut communication with battalion headquarters. At 11:47, Chen's team encountered what sounded like Japanese soldiers moving through bamboo 50 yards ahead, but the challenge and password system that had worked flawlessly for weeks suddenly became useless when no one could hear verbal commands over the drumming rain. Chen made the decision that Carlson's training had prepared him for. He fired 3 controlled bursts from his Thompson at muzzle flashes barely visible through the vegetation, maintaining fire discipline and staying within his assigned sector. The return fire that followed told a different story than the successful engagements that had built Raider confidence over the previous month. Chen's team was taking fire from American weapons, Garand rifles, and a Browning automatic rifle, fired by Marines from Fox Company, who had been conducting their own patrol along a route that intersected Chen's sector, without either team knowing the other was operating in the area. The firefight lasted 18 minutes before both teams realized their mistake, but the psychological damage was immediate and severe. 3 Marines had been wounded, including Chen himself, who took a Garand round through his left shoulder while trying to signal his identity with hand grenades. The friendly fire incident that commanders had been dreading since the campaign began had finally happened, and it occurred despite all the procedures, training, and fire discipline that had made the Thompson seem safe again. Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hannekin, who had watched Chen's near miss in September evolve into the broader Thompson controversy, found himself facing the same tactical paralysis that had gripped Marine commanders 3 months earlier. The weapon that had become the centerpiece of successful small unit tactics was suddenly dangerous again, and the confidence that had made Raiders effective in close-range combat was evaporating as word of the December 9th incident spread through the Lunga perimeter. Major General Alexander von de Grift, preparing to turn over command of Guadalcanal operations to Army forces and redeploy his Marines to Australia, recognized that the friendly fire problem represented something deeper than equipment or training failures. American forces were tired, operating beyond their physical and psychological limits after 4 months of continuous combat in conditions that tested every aspect of military professionalism. The procedures that worked when Marines were fresh and alert became unreliable when exhaustion, stress, and equipment failures created the chaos that characterized real combat operations. But Carlson's response to the December crisis revealed why his tactical innovations had survived when other attempts at doctrine reform had failed. Rather than abandoning the Thompson or retreating to the defensive posture that had characterized American jungle fighting before the Raider experiments, Carlson treated the friendly fire incident as a system failure that required systematic solutions. The problem wasn't that his fire discipline procedures were wrong. The problem was that they hadn't accounted for the degraded conditions that would inevitably occur during extended combat operations. The solutions that emerged from Carlson's analysis of the December 9th incident became the foundation for American small unit tactics throughout the Pacific War. Patrol coordination procedures were tightened to ensure that overlapping routes were identified and communicated before teams departed their base areas. Radio communication protocols were simplified to function even when atmospheric conditions made voice transmission unreliable. Most importantly, Marines were trained to recognize the signs of system breakdown, exhaustion, equipment failure, communication loss, and modify their procedures accordingly rather than abandoning them entirely. Sergeant Anthony Palladino, who had proven the effectiveness of Raider fire team tactics during the November operations, led the effort to rebuild confidence in close-range automatic weapons employment after the December incident. His approach was practical rather than inspirational. Marines needed to understand that friendly fire was a risk in any tactical system, but that the alternative, abandoning effective weapons because they were dangerous, would result in higher casualties from enemy action than from occasional mistakes among Americans. The broader strategic context gave weight to Palladino's argument. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were retreating westward toward evacuation points, but they remained dangerous opponents who used jungle terrain and night movement to maximum advantage. American patrols that couldn't employ their full range of weapons effectively would suffer higher casualties during the final phase of the campaign when enemy soldiers had nothing to lose and every reason to fight desperately. By January 1943, as Army units took over primary responsibility for Guadalcanal operations and Marine forces prepared for the next phase of the Pacific offensive, the Thompson submachine gun had evolved from a controversial weapon that commanders feared to use into a proven tool for close-range combat in jungle conditions. The transformation hadn't occurred because the weapon's characteristics had changed, but because Marines had learned to employ it within a tactical system that addressed its limitations while maximizing its effectiveness. Lieutenant William White, whose patrol reports had documented the original sound identification crisis, wrote the final assessment that would guide Marine Corps' small unit tactics for the remainder of the Pacific War. The winning weapon, White concluded, wasn't necessarily the most powerful or the most advanced. It was the one that Marines could use effectively on the worst night, under the most degraded conditions, without losing control of themselves or their tactical situation. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal regarding Thompson employment became doctrine that spread throughout Marine units preparing for operations in the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The weapon itself remained essentially unchanged, a shoulder-fired submachine gun firing .45 caliber ammunition from 20-round box magazines or 50-round drums, capable of controlled automatic fire at ranges up to 100 yards. But the tactical system surrounding it had been proven in combat conditions that tested every assumption about American fighting ability in jungle terrain. Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, ending a campaign that had cost both sides heavily but established American superiority in the kind of close-range, small-unit combat that would characterize Pacific fighting for the next 2.5 years. The Thompson submachine gun, dismissed by some as unsuitable for jungle conditions and feared by others as too dangerous for night operations, had become the symbol of American adaptability and the foundation of tactical innovations that would prove decisive in campaigns yet to come.